Welcome back, and now we're going to spend some time discussing Virgil's Aeneid, the actual poem. So please again make sure that you're open to page 857 in your Harris-Platzner textbook, and again feel free to leaf through as you need to as I describe this poem. So I'm going to again try to keep this brief because the poem is obviously a lot longer than what appears in your textbook, but I'll just give you some of the main points for you to understand here. So Aeneid, as you have explained in the textbook, is the documentation of the escape of the Trojan hero Aeneas from Troy. He flees from Troy westward. He is told to go to some strange place called Italy, and he flees westward, and after some misadventures here and there, he finally ends up arriving in Italy. The main misadventure that you do have fully in your textbook, of course, is his arrival at Carthage, where he encounters Queen Dido. You may recall, this is a little bit strange, that he arrives at Carthage because he is driven ashore there by a storm that was actually whipped up by Queen Juno. Now, Juno, of course, is the Greek Hera. Juno, as a Roman goddess, has not lost any of her hatred for Troy that she had as Hera because of the judgment of Paris, where she wasn't picked for the golden apple. But the additional problem now that Juno is described as having, which is now how we turn Juno into the Roman goddess, is that Juno, as we learn it in the beginning of book 1, has a very great fondness for Carthage. And she has been told that it is written in the fates that the new city of Rome that will be the outcome of Aeneas' arrival in Italy will eventually destroy her favorite city of Carthage. So she wants to do everything she can to block Aeneas' passage, safe passage to Italy, much the same way that Poseidon does everything he can to block Odysseus' safe passage home to Ithaca because of the personal affront that Odysseus had committed against Poseidon because of refusing to thank him for the Trojan War and also for blinding the Cyclops and then claiming, oh, it was me, Odysseus, who got you, and so forth. So Cyclops, of course, was the son of Poseidon, so that was unwise, as you may remember. So Juno, in much the same manner, besets Aeneas with a whole lot of obstacles and setbacks as it goes along. I said that it's strange because in sending Aeneas to Carthage, oddly, Juno actually helps bring about herself the destruction of Carthage. Here's why. Because Aeneas lands actually in Libya, not far away from Carthage. Now Carthage today is located in the country of Tunisia. And if you look on a map, you'll see that Tunisia is west and northwest of Libya. So Aeneas would actually have landed in Libya and then would have had to travel a little bit northwest in order to get to now where Carthage is. And so Aeneas lands there, and then he is escorted from where he lands by Venus, his mother, over to Carthage. And by then his men have already met Queen Dido, and then he suddenly appears out of the scene, out of a cloud, and she's startled, wondering who in the world this is. And then, of course, she finally invites him in when she realizes who he is. These are obviously all wayfarers. She herself is a wayfarer because she had to escape her home city of Tyre because of her brother who murdered her husband. The brother was Pygmalion. Her husband was Sychaeus. She's still loyal to her deceased husband Sychaeus, and that's going to play a very big role in what happens in book 4. So Aeneas is invited into Carthage and attends the banquet for Queen Dido. And this is where misfortune happens. Because Dido and Aeneas send Aeneas' son Ascanius, also known as Iulus, not coincidentally with the fact that this is connected with Julius Caesar, but actually Iulus is referring to Iulum, which is Ilium, which is one of the names for Troy. Ascanius goes back to the ship to get something, and at that point Venus grabs him and puts him to sleep and substitutes her own son Cupid in his place, in his likeness. And Cupid causes Dido, by breathing on her, to gradually fall in love with Aeneas and to want to give up her own loyalty to Sychaeus. So she insists that Aeneas tell the whole story of the fall of Troy, which he does through books 2 and 3. And then after that, Dido herself is actually in love with Aeneas, and Juno and Venus conspire for the two of them to end up getting married together because they go together on a hunt. Then there's a storm, and they get driven to a cave. And then when they arrive at the cave, there's nature takes its course, and Dido thinks that she's married, but the marriage is not in fact a legal one because Aeneas is a foreigner. And King Iarbas of Libya hears about this from Rumor, the gossip goddess, and complains to Jupiter, the Roman Zeus. It's curious that Jupiter exists at this time and that Iarbas can actually worship him as a Libyan king, but whatever. Does so, and Jupiter then sends Hermes, Mercury, down to Aeneas to inform him that he needs to leave Carthage and leave Dido behind. And that leads to the big tragedy in which Dido ends up committing suicide because she cannot stand the loss of Aeneas and everything that she'd invested into Carthage. So there's several things about the story of Dido and Carthage to bring out here. First of all is the obvious fact that Carthage was really destroyed by the Romans about a century and a half or so before the composition of Aeneid. So there's obviously a need for Augustus, among other bits of Roman history, to justify Rome's decision to completely destroy a city, which back in the ancient world was a very unusual and not exactly favorable act to take to conclude a war. So we have, at great pains, it depicted why Carthage ends up becoming a specific enemy of the Romans, and of course that's because Juno curses Carthage to become the enemy of the Romans permanently after she sees Aeneas sailing away from Carthage, having now finally permanently left her behind with not so much as a goodbye. And so that is her explosive, outraged reaction to curse the cities of Carthage and Rome to be permanent enemies thereafter. And so with that curse in place, it is perfectly justifiable for the Romans, having found Carthage to be in their way of their own expansion, to conquer Carthage actually 3 times in 3 separate Punic Wars, and then finally eventually to destroy Carthage completely. Okay, so all of this, of course, is really a sidetrack from the main story of Aeneas himself. Aeneas is described to us by Virgil as pious, P-I-U-S, which is pious in the sense of being devoted to one's duty, which in Latin is officium, and is a big deal in Roman social relations. Officium is really one's own duty to one's family and also to one's state. And so Aeneas, therefore, is being depicted as the proper Roman hero, devoted to the destiny that he must follow and to the duty that he has to ensure the proper foundation of Rome. So if that means not being sidetracked with Dido, having to leave her behind, that's what he must do as a proper Roman hero. Now, he's sort of mealy-mouthed about it when he talks about it with Dido in Book 4, the big lovers' quarrel between them. He's not exactly very forthright about his dealings with her, but it becomes pretty clear from the later developments that he is in fact to be celebrated for doing the right thing, even though we have to realize that his treatment of women, just like the typical treatment of women by heroes in both Greek and Roman mythology, is definitely less than favorable, and really had a part in why Dido ended up eventually committing suicide. Aeneas ends up actually having to suffer remorse for that decision in Book 6 when he's down in the underworld. He'll see Dido's ghost. He'll try to reconcile with her at that moment, and she's completely hard as a rock at that point, refuses to even look at him, and finally flees off and rejoins her husband Zacchaeus' ghost. And so that's the ultimate repudiation of Aeneas' decision to leave Dido behind. So it's curious that Virgil spends so much time on this whole episode, because it seems to detract from the positivity of Aeneas' main mission. The point is, as we said, that Aeneas is pious. He is always pious and devoted to his proper duty, as well as to family, seeing to it that his friend Achates and his son Ascanius are always looked after. And he's steadfast in getting his travels through. And when he finally gets to Italy itself, he is steadfast in trying his best to look after the son of the king, Pallas, even though he eventually loses him. And it's that anger that he feels about Pallas' death that's going to impel him eventually to kill his adversary Turnus in the final scene of Aeneid. Aeneas also, once he's connected with King Latinus, graciously accepts the betrothal to Lavinia, not at that moment aware of all the tragedy that's going to cause, because Queen Amata raises the roof about it. She wants Lavinia joined to her original fiance. That's, of course, Turnus. Turnus himself isn't so bad off about it, but then once again, Juno shows up. And she, this time, is accompanied by the Fury Electo. And the Fury Electo spreads fire everywhere. Firebrands into the, she puts a snake in Queen Amata's heart, and she basically blasts Turnus with a very bright light, and she spreads fire everywhere among all the fields in order to cause warfare to happen, and that's how Aeneas ends up in warfare with Turnus and with all the other Rutulians and the enemies of the Latins at that point. And it's that war that ends up occupying the rest of Aeneid down to book 12, and with the final duel between Aeneas and Turnus. So what's going on here? Aeneas is depicted as the ideal Roman hero. Turnus, who kills Aeneas's friend Pallas, and then vaunts the slaughter by wearing the belt on his uniform, is depicted as the hubristic antagonist, the one that Aeneas definitely has to get rid of. Aeneas was told in Book 6, when he went down to the underworld to visit his father Anchises, that his main responsibility as a Roman leader in the future, and this is the first time, by the way, that he's referred to as Roman, is going to be to spread the rule of Rome everywhere, to be gracious to those who are humble, and spare them, but to be harsh and severe with those who are proud, to tame them. So obviously Turnus falls in this last category, and Aeneas, in fact, does consider sparing him, but then when he sees the belt of Pallas, that sparks his own personal anger against Turnus, and he finally, in a fit of rage, slaughters Turnus on the battlefield, and with that very abrupt end, we have no further word from Virgil. So it's in this way that we see Aeneas establish himself as leader, but we never get any positive word afterwards about how Rome was afterwards to be founded. We just have this final, very disturbing scene of Aeneas slaughtering Turnus in a fit of anger, and we get the impression that it's this fit of power-thirsty rage that we're supposed to understand the Roman Empire to be all about. That we have to accept that that is indeed what happened in the history of the foundation of the Roman Empire, and that despite it, the Romans still are in power and they need to be accepted as the worthwhile leaders of the Roman world. So it's a very tricky balance to strike that Virgil seems to put up here. And in fact, some scholars have consider the possibility that maybe this ending to Aeneid might be incomplete, because Virgil did die before actually finishing it. It's not known for sure whether there was in fact more to add. Actually, book 12, the last book, is a fairly long one by the standards of the books, so it's a little hard to believe that more was going to be added on. But it's hard to know. It's possible that something at the end might have been added to give a better ending for the Aeneid. But in any event, you can see therefore the difficulty with Aeneid as the proper Roman hero versus Aeneid the person given to almost a babyish grief in book 1, where he wishes to die when he's stuck in the storm, to the way that his mother treats him, and he says, "Mom, why don't you show yourself as your proper self? Why do you always fool me?" That's also in book 1. To the fact that he wants to kill Helen in a rage, and then his mother takes him back. That's in book 2 during the fall of Troy. The fact that he has to take responsibility for leading the Trojans, even though he loses his wife. So that's another step. And then he does actually lead get the Romans to Carthage, and then eventually on to Italy itself, having to leave Dido behind. So he's gradually learning how to take responsibility, and then he does learn what his real responsibility is when he meets his father Anchises down in the underworld, where he shows him the dynasty that's going to be formed in Rome thereafter. And so when Aeneas sees this, then he has a much stronger sense of what he's actually fighting for. And so when he leaves the underworld, he has a renewed sense of devotion to his faith. But it is curious, however, that he leaves through the gate of false dreams, the Ivory Gate, and it's what one sometimes wonders if possibly that's supposed to indicate that maybe there's something illusory or not really quite with it about this vision of the Roman Empire to come. So Aeneas does, in this sense, come off as one of the typical heroes like Hercules and Theseus and Achilles that we've seen before. But it's clear that he also does have this Roman stamp on him, and yet there's still a sense that something is a little off about him. The fact that he sort of garbles his words trying to explain to Dido exactly why he has to leave, the fact that he is driven to a fit of rage over the death of Pallas. Obviously it was true that Pallas was in his trust. And then finally the fact that he does kill Turnus in this really sickening, bloodthirsty way. All of this gives the impression that the Romans do really understand that Aeneas is really no more perfect a human being than anybody else, even though he is in fact the archetypal Roman hero, and that the Romans do have to accept in their own past that quite a few mishaps occurred in the foundation of this colony, Lavinium, that would eventually become the Roman Empire. So Virgil composes this work with maybe some question marks about really whether the foundation of the Roman Empire that we finally get really was worth all of it. There is some thought sometimes that perhaps Virgil in fact was intending to criticize the foundation of Rome because of all of the damage that it did. That's possible, but it should be pointed out that Augustus did accept the poem as it was, and although Virgil on his deathbed wanted it to be burned, Augustus actually preserved it and saw to its publication after Virgil's death, and of course that was very fortunate for later literary input. So would Augustus have done so if he had sensed that in fact Rome was being criticized? It's hard to know, but it is pretty clear from pieces of evidence such as I've listed that Virgil is not definitely 100% sold on the positivity of the Roman Empire, as one might initially believe from the way that he opens the work. A couple of little additional details to put in. Of course, the opening lines are quite interesting. Arma rubumque cano, Troiae primus arboris, Italiam. Arms and the man I sing. Arma rubumque cano in Latin, meaning it's war that immediately is given attention at the very beginning. Arms, warfare, and a man. So the warfare is the thing that the Romans are celebrating there, again recognizing that it was from warfare that their origin comes from, and then it's the man who brought all this warfare to pass in order to see that Rome would eventually be founded. That's one point. So that shows how we celebrate Aeneas that way. But there's also one last detail about Aeneas that's a bit disturbing. When Aeneas is told that he's going to go down into the underworld with Sibyl, who is the prophetess, she tells him as priestess that she has to take a token with him to get him across the Styx River. He has to find a golden branch on a tree. He does actually find it, and he climbs the tree and he takes it off and gives it to Sibyl. However, Virgil doesn't even leave this incident without some interesting description. The way he describes it is he grabs onto the branch, it hesitates, in Latin cunctator is the word, and then he rips it, wrenches it off the tree in his eagerness. It's almost like he can't help himself but just grab onto this branch that he absolutely needs in order to be able to continue forward. And he has almost that destructive rage seeming to break out of him as he grabs onto that branch because he's so eager to get it. And you wouldn't worry about that so much in itself, except that you know that it's that eagerness to accomplish his power and the foundation of Rome, maybe, that is eventually going to also take down Turnus. So it's a disturbing detail, and again it suggests that maybe all isn't completely well with the foundation of Rome as it turned out. All right, so that's what I have to say here about Aeneid. I hope you got a deep appreciation of Aeneid as you got to read it, and in later videos we're going to be turning to our final author, Ovid, and his great work, Metamorphoses. We'll see you next video.